He stood before thousands every Sunday morning, Bible in hand, preaching about purity, faithfulness, and the sanctity of marriage. His voice echoed through the sanctuary with conviction. But while his congregation bowed their heads in prayer, he was living a secret so explosive, so reckless, that when it finally came to light, it would cost him everything. Not just his career, not just his reputation, but something far more personal, something that would leave doctors stunned and a community shattered. This is the true story of a Florida pastor whose double life spiraled into a medical nightmare that no one saw coming, and by the time the truth emerged, it was already too late. Let's call him Michael Hayes. To the outside world, Michael was the embodiment of moral authority. He led one of the fastest-growing congregations in Central Florida, a sprawling church with over 3,000 members who hung on his every word. Michael didn't just preach, he performed. His sermons were theatrical, emotional, filled with tears and laughter and moments that made people feel seen. He counseled married couples struggling with infidelity. He baptized their children. He visited the sick and prayed over hospital beds. Parents pointed to him as an example for their sons. Wives admired his devotion to his own family, at least the family everyone thought he had. Michael drove a modest sedan, wore simple suits, and often spoke about the dangers of materialism and temptation. He was, by all appearances, a man of God. But appearances, as we'll soon discover, can be carefully constructed lies. Because while Michael stood in the light on Sundays, he spent his weeknights in shadows that grew darker with every passing month. And the deeper he went, the harder it became to crawl back out. It started small, or at least that's what Michael probably told himself. A private meeting here, a late-night conversation there. But over the course of 5 years, Michael Hayes built an entire second existence that ran parallel to his public ministry. He frequented online platforms where anonymity was guaranteed and moral accountability didn't exist. He traveled under fake names to motels an hour outside his city. He met strangers, dozens of them, then hundreds. Some encounters were brief, others became recurring arrangements. And Michael, ever the charismatic leader, knew exactly how to make people trust him even when they shouldn't. He never used his real title in these spaces. He was just Mike, a businessman passing through town, charming and attentive. But beneath that charm was a compulsion he couldn't control. By the time investigators would later piece together his movements, they estimated he had been involved with over 450 individuals during this period. 450. Let that number sink in. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a systematic pattern of deception that required planning, secrecy, and an almost sociopathic ability to compartmentalize. Some members of his inner circle later admitted they'd noticed changes. Michael became more distant. He stopped attending staff meetings. His sermons, while still powerful, began to feel rehearsed rather than heartfelt. But no one dared question him. After all, he was Pastor Michael Hayes, and in their world, that title carried unshakable authority. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By the summer of 2024, Michael's double life had reached a boiling point. He was no longer just meeting people occasionally. He was doing it multiple times a week, sometimes multiple times in a single night. The risks he took became more brazen. He stopped being careful. Maybe he thought he was invincible. Maybe the adrenaline had become its own addiction. Or maybe, deep down, some part of him wanted to get caught because the weight of the secret was crushing him. Friends who knew him during this time said he looked exhausted. His eyes were hollow. He'd lost weight. His wife, Emily, later told authorities she barely recognized the man she'd been married to for 15 years. He was irritable, paranoid, constantly checking his phone. When she asked if something was wrong, he'd snap at her or retreat into silence. But Emily, like everyone else, assumed it was stress from the church. Attendance was booming. Donations were up. Surely that kind of growth came with pressure. What she didn't know was that Michael was living on borrowed time. His body, pushed to extremes by sleepless nights and reckless behavior, was beginning to break down. And one night in late August, everything came crashing down in the most unimaginable way. By sunrise, Michael Hayes would lose more than his reputation. He would lose a part of himself that could never be restored, and the mystery of how it happened would haunt investigators for months. It was a Saturday night. Michael told Emily he had a late meeting with the church's board of elders to discuss the upcoming building expansion. She didn't question it. She never did. Instead, Michael drove 40 minutes south to a budget motel off Interstate 4, the kind of place where no one asks questions and cameras are broken more often than they work. He'd been there before. This time, though, something felt different. He was more reckless than usual, pushing boundaries he'd previously avoided. According to medical records that would later surface, Michael had been using performance-enhancing substances to keep up with the demands of his secret life. Pills ordered online, injections he administered himself. He wasn't a doctor. He had no idea what he was doing. And that night, in that motel room, his body finally revolted. Around 3 a.m, Michael experienced severe complications. The details are graphic, but what matters is this. By the time emergency services arrived, Michael was in excruciating pain, barely conscious, and suffering from a condition so severe that doctors later described it as catastrophic. He was rushed to the nearest hospital, where a trauma team worked frantically to stabilize him. But the damage was irreversible. Within hours, Michael Hayes underwent an emergency surgical procedure that would permanently alter his body. He lost his genitalia completely. The medical term is penile necrosis, a condition where tissue dies due to lack of blood flow, often triggered by drug misuse or extreme physical trauma. For Michael, it was both. And as he lay in that hospital bed, sedated and bandaged, the secret life he'd fought so hard to hide was about to explode into the open. When Emily received the call from the hospital, she was told her husband had been in an accident. She rushed to his side, frantic and confused. But when doctors pulled her aside and explained what had actually happened, her world shattered. This wasn't an accident. This was the result of choices Michael had been making for years, choices she knew nothing about. Within days, law enforcement became involved. Not because Michael had committed a crime in the traditional sense, but because the circumstances surrounding his hospitalization raised questions. The motel manager, suspicious of the commotion, had already contacted police. Michael's phone, recovered from the scene, contained thousands of messages, photos, and location data that painted a disturbing picture. Detectives spent weeks unraveling his digital footprint. They found profiles on multiple websites, transaction records for motels across 3 counties, evidence of encounters that numbered in the hundreds. Some of the individuals Michael had been involved with were later contacted by investigators. Many were shocked to learn his true identity. Others weren't surprised at all. They'd suspected something was off about Mike, the businessman who always paid in cash and never stayed the night. As word spread through the community, the church erupted. Members demanded answers. Staff resigned. The Board of Elders held an emergency meeting and released a statement expressing their shock and heartbreak. But the damage was done. Attendance dropped by half within 2 weeks. Families who had dedicated years to the congregation walked away, unable to reconcile the man they'd trusted with the monster they now knew. And Michael, still recovering in a hospital bed, faced a future more terrifying than anything he'd ever preached about. How do you rebuild a life when everything you were has been surgically removed, both literally and figuratively? Michael Hayes was eventually discharged from the hospital, but he never went home. Emily filed for divorce within a month, taking their 2 children and moving out of state to escape the media frenzy. The church, once a beacon of hope for thousands, closed its doors permanently 6 months later, unable to recover from the scandal. Lawsuits followed. Former members accused the church leadership of enabling Michael's behavior by refusing to ask hard questions. Some of the individuals he'd been involved with came forward with their own stories, describing manipulation and deceit. Michael himself retreated from public view entirely. Last anyone heard, he was living in a small town in the Midwest under a different name, working a manual labor job and avoiding all human connection. His physical injuries were permanent, but it was the psychological scars that seemed to weigh heaviest. According to one former colleague who spoke anonymously, Michael expressed deep regret in a private conversation. He said he wished he'd been caught sooner, before things escalated to the point of no return. But regret doesn't undo damage. The families who looked up to him still carry the betrayal. The community he once led still bears the scars. And the question that haunts everyone who knew him is this: how did a man who preached so powerfully about truth live such a monstrous lie? Michael Hayes' story isn't just about hypocrisy. It's about the dangerous intersection of power, secrecy, and compulsion. It's about what happens when someone builds an identity so fragile that it can only survive in darkness. And it's a reminder that the loudest voices preaching morality are sometimes the ones hiding the darkest secrets. So, here's the question I want to leave you with. Do you think what happened to Michael was justice, some form of cosmic punishment for his deception? Or was it a tragic spiral of addiction and self-destruction that could have been prevented if anyone had intervened sooner? How would you feel if someone you trusted, someone you looked up to, turned out to be living a lie this extreme? And if you were in his congregation, would you have been able to forgive him? Or would the betrayal have been too deep? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to hear where you stand on this. And if this story affected you, if it made you think twice about the people we put on pedestals, then make sure you're subscribed, because next week we're covering another case that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about trust and power. Until then, stay curious, stay critical, and remember that the truth is always stranger and more tragic than fiction.